are recording now here on the first Sunday after Christmas. Yes, technically we are still in the 12 days of Christmas. Is that correct? I know Doug knows the answer to that question. All right. Today I thought we would pick up a little bit on the bridging history that will get us to the other solas, and then I think we'll get into the other solas today. So I'm not going to spend much time in review, but by point of quick review, what year do we normally hold to as being the sort of recognized start of the Reformation? Does anybody remember?
Would you say the date?
The year.
Oh, the
I'll
year.
take the date too.
Well, isn't it October
1570.
31st?
Yeah.
517?
1517, yeah.
15, I mean, yeah.
And the event is the supposed tacking of the theses on the door at Wittenberg. We've talked about that a lot of times by Martin Luther. Although we also talked about that, in many ways the Reformation was already going on at least a century before with folks like Wycliffe and Huss and some of the others that had raised some of the same questions that Luther was raising. But we recognize this as being the formal time of the Reformation. I know this timeline is going to be almost impossible to read, but I'm so attracted to timelines. I don't know why that is. But just to put things in context here again, here's the red in the lower right, and I'm going to have a blown up version of this here in a minute. There's the 1517. So the stuff that you see in red here is the things that relate to the Reformation. Again, just putting it in context, we are several centuries removed from 1215, the Lateran Council. We're a good ways removed from the period covered by the Black Death, the plague in Europe. And so we're also now post 1492. So remember, Columbus has not only lived and died and sailed, but there's a new world that's been discovered, at least to the Europeans. It wasn't new to the folks that were already there. And so this is sort of the time frame that we find ourselves in again there in 1517. And so moving to the next thing, which is a blow up of that. Generally speaking, you'll notice that the Reformation comes at the end of the broad period normally thought of as the Renaissance. And it's tough to actually put exact dates on the Renaissance, but the Renaissance has been happening. And the reason I wanted to make sure I included that and talked about it for a minute is, as you might guess, there was an influence from the Renaissance on the church and from the church on the Renaissance. So just briefly speaking, when I say Renaissance, what pops into your head?
Art.
Kathy just said art.
Well, a very particular type of art, very kind of stylized.
And what is the term Renaissance, other than the specific period here? When we use the term generally, when we say that something is having a Renaissance, what do we mean?
Renewed, rebirth.
A kind of revival.
Yeah, a revival. So the Renaissance, big R Renaissance here, was the revival of what?
Culture. Learning.
Culture. Yeah, culture and learning in, if you will, the big C classical sense.
Yes.
So during this period of time, there was a resurgence and an understanding of Greek, a rereading and rediscovery of many of the Greek classics, relating both to Greek mythology, but also Greek writing, folks like things like Plato and Aristotle. Remember, Socrates never wrote anything. All that we have of Socrates is what Plato wrote. But the Socratic ideas, Platonism, Aristotle, and then also a revival of learning in terms of a classic sense of science. A lot of this actually brought back, interestingly enough, one of the triggers for the Renaissance was actually the Crusades, because of the contact that happened between Europe and the Near East and the Middle East, where a lot of this learning that had been lost during the Dark Ages in Europe had never been lost, for example, in Persia and other parts of the world, and so it was brought back. So the Renaissance and an emphasis on learning and scholarship and scholasticism is an important factor that's leading up to and providing energy towards the Reformation itself. And so, for example, that's what's going on in the monasteries. Again, the direct reading of some of the things in Greek and Greek classics. We'll even talk about how much Calvin, for example, is influenced by those things. And so I just want to put us back in the context of the timeline before we start going through it a little bit more, and then start working through this part and then getting to the other parts of the theological implication. So again, 1517 is the date, the 95 Theses posted by Luther. It takes a couple of years, though, for the debate and the discussion and a lot of the controversy to arise. So by 1519 is when we actually had the Leipzig, what's called the Leipzig disposition or the Leipzig debate. This is actually between Johann Eck, who was one of the leading forces for the Catholic Church, debating Luther over this concept of sola scriptura, what we've been talking about for the last few weeks. And so initially there is sort of what Luther intended to originally have happen, with this discussion that would flow from the 95 Theses. But as things are expounded out and his views become more widely known, primarily because of the printing press and because of the publication of documents, that changes from a Christian scholastic discussion into a much broader issue. And so in 1520, for example, 3 of Luther's works are published to the Christian nobility of the German nation, on the Babylon captivity, and on the freedom of a Christian. And as Luther starts to write and expound upon those things that he's come to realize and that were native in the 95 Theses and the selling of the indulgences, there comes to be more and more contention between Luther and the papacy. And so this leads to the events of Luther being ultimately declared a heretic, and thus having to appear in January through May in 1521 at the Diet of Worms. The Diet was a meeting generally of the Holy Roman Empire, so they didn't meet just to discuss Luther's issues. The Diet had a bigger thing, but the big event inside of that was Luther appearing to answer the charges of heresy, which had already been placed upon him. So this is his last chance to do one of two things: either renounce what he's written and what he said, or he's now going to be formally excommunicated. And if he's declared a heretic and excommunicated, does everybody realize what that means for Luther individually?
Well, to be excommunicated from what we've studied meant basically to be outside of the church, and the church was where, basically everything that was part of life generated from.
So he's going to be outside of society, really, as a whole, if he's excommunicated. And to be declared a heretic, put what on him?
Like a bounty.
Basically, he's a persona non grata because he's excommunicated. There's no place he can go where he can find inside of the formal church where he can find someone who will support him. And as a heretic, he can basically be captured by any civil authority and put to death because of his heresy. The church did not execute heretics. Civil authorities executed heretics because the church had declared them so. And so remember, we talked about him getting, with the benefit of Frederick III, who actually negotiated his safe travel to the Diet. Remember, better than John Huss, he got clarification that he was also going to be able to leave. And then he's quote unquote kidnapped by some of Frederick's folks who carry him off to the castle in Wartburg for his own safety. So at the Diet of Worms, Luther is given the chance to renounce after saying he wants a night to think about it, comes back and says, no, what I've written is what I've written. And so at that point, the formal break in terms of Luther and the church is finalized in 1521 at the Diet of Worms. By this point, though, the Reformation movement has started to spread throughout Europe and is gaining momentum and is gaining steam. Interestingly enough, also in that same year, here's Henry VIII there on the left. The King of England writes something known as actually he writes a couple of different things, but one of them is a pamphlet, which translated as The Defense of the Seven Sacraments. And he actually is writing in opposition to Luther. So at this point, Henry is still very much a Catholic. So much so that he writes this. Remember, Henry was the second son. His older brother Arthur was to have been king and was originally married to Catherine, who later becomes Henry's bride. And we all pretty much know that story. If you're not, talk to my daughter; she'll fill you in on all the details. But at this point, remember, Henry as the second son would have most likely been targeted to not be king, but actually to go into a role inside of the church. So he had been trained in theological matters from his youth. And so he actually writes this pamphlet in response to Luther, and he's actually awarded the title Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo the 10th. If you have an appreciation for irony, this is one of those ironic moments here in 1521. Luther is being formally excommunicated and formally declared a heretic, no turning back. And Henry is on the opposite side, being praised by the Pope as Defender of the Faith. By the way, a title that still is carried by the monarch of England among their long list of titles, even though it has a different meaning now. That will happen later. In 1522, remember, Luther's been spirited away to the Wartburg Castle. And so while he's sort of in hiding, pretending to be a sort of a lowly knight or a lowly like a page, he's working on his translation of the Bible into German, beginning with the New Testament. And so he completes and publishes his New Testament translation into German fairly quickly. He'd already been working on it, but has the time to focus on that while he's in sort of exile and hiding in Wartburg. And I just see the note here. For those of you that haven't seen it in the chat, Sherry's letting us know that Zach apparently has tested positive. So we'll pray for him as well. And then later, the Old Testament translation is posted, but Luther's priority was to get the Bible, the New Testament, into German. I just throw this in here because we're going to come back and talk about it later. This is 1522. In 1525, the Anabaptist movement is born. This is the Swiss reformer Zwingli, who formally denounces the doctrine of infant baptism and advocates adult baptism when they're old enough to confess their sins. So one of the possible sources of modern Baptist theology might be tied to the Anabaptists, but we'll reserve that as something that we talk about when we sort of cover all the various positions and theories on that. But 1525 is when the Anabaptists, as part of the Reformation movement, break specifically on this particular issue from the church. In 1526, William Tyndale publishes his translation of the New Testament in English. We owe a lot to Tyndale's Bible, his translation, because much of Tyndale's English translation is what ends up becoming part of the King James translation. And so in 1526, he publishes this. He is actually not in England. He's had to flee to the continent. Most of that time is spent in what we call the Netherlands today. And he's in hiding from Henry. Remember, Henry is still Catholic. And so he's not allowed to do this actually in England. In 1529, Luther and Zwingli, who we just mentioned there with the Anabaptists, meet, and they discuss some of the theological issues, and they're unable to come into agreement, particularly on things like the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So this is the question of transubstantiation and the other things that are there. And so while they agree on a number of the reform issues, they don't agree enough to sort of unite their efforts with Zwingli holding more of a symbolic view of the sacraments, and Luther holding more, if you will, more of the traditional Catholic view of the elements of the Lord's Supper, but actually becoming the body and blood of Christ. In 1530, go ahead.
In one of the podcasts that I've listened to, I don't remember if it was Bruce Gore or someone else, they were saying that Luther basically stormed out of the meeting reciting in Latin, "This is my body, this is my body."
Yeah. Once Luther got the grasp of that whole scripture thing, he really got the grasp of that whole scripture thing, right?
He was, pretty dogmatic sometimes.
Yeah. And was known to have, Luther's an interesting just character as a personality, was known to have something of a temper, but also known to be, somewhat fun-loving and other things as well. So Luther, the person, comes out when you read some of these stories about what was going on here. And again, this is now far enough removed by 1529 to 1517 that, the Reformation is fully there, and he's fully the target, no doubt, of the Reformation. 1530, the Augsburg Confession is created. This is actually a meeting that has come together, and it actually sort of outlines Lutheran theology and practice. So for the first time, there's actually a document that sort of puts the Reformation, particularly Luther's view and those that were following Luther, puts their thoughts and their theology down on paper and in writing where they can all look at it. So that's an important thing. 1531, this is an important thing to understand. Zwingli dies. He's actually killed in a battle. It's, we sometimes think about all of this as being, scholastic and educational, but there was actually physical armed warfare over these religious questions. And this was actually inside of Switzerland, inside the Swiss Confederacy, that various elements that were Catholic and Protestant, because there was very much a mixed element there in what we think of today as being Switzerland. They actually, during one of the battles, Zwingli actually dies in that battle, the Battle of Cappel. 1533, remember Henry, very Catholic, right? Well, that changes a little bit, and what actually gets launched is the English Reformation. The English Reformation is an interesting thing to think of as being part of the Reformation, but part of being separate. Because what was already going on in England, going back to the days of Wycliffe, about a century before, actually a little bit more than a century before now, was there was already a Reformation movement that existed in England well before Luther's launching in 1517. But it was very much suppressed and not getting a lot of traction until the Continental Reformation came along with Luther and Zwingli and Calvin as well. And again, initially Henry is in opposition to that, stamping out Protestant elements in England. But the famous reaches the point they do not have a male heir, he and his wife Catherine, and so he has sought an annulment or a proper divorce from the Pope, who refuses it. And so Thomas Cranmer, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, in defiance of the Catholic Church, declares Henry and Catherine's marriage to be null and void. And this begins this phase of the English Reformation, which is more in many ways a political phase of the English Reformation. But don't forget that there was a theological component that already existed. But also don't lose track of the fact that, remember what Henry was lauded for less than a decade before was what? Defending Catholicism. It's not that Henry has had a tremendous change of heart regarding the theology. He's had a change of heart because of his marital status and wanting to have a male heir. And so 1533 is the launch formally of the English Reformation, which has more of a political bend to it during most of it than it does a theological bend to it. Just a side note here, in 1534, the Jesuits are founded, the Society of Jesus by Ignatius of Loyola, and they are part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Jesuits, we think of them today primarily as from their schools and other things that are educational in bend, and there very much is that. But does anybody know anything much more about the Jesuits and who they were?
They were kind of the enforcement arm of the Counter Reformation, weren't they? I mean,
they were
Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, militant might be a good way to describe them. And and their opposition was not just educational and theological; it was definitely that. But in addition to that, it was also heavily centered around being, like I said, they were sort of the enforcement arm, and were very widespread and became very powerful as part of the Counter-Reformation. And it's an interesting thing just to study the history of the Jesuits, because they were very different than the Franciscans and the Dominicans. This wasn't these weren't just friars. These were militants for the faith. And so they formed in 1534 as part of the Counter-Reformation.
It really surprised me to learn that, because I think of them now today. I think of them as being a very scholastic. As you were saying, you think of them in connection with schools and learning. But yeah, and to be called the Society of Jesus, that to me that's ironic.
Yeah. And they were priests, you know, you'll see them sometimes described as almost like priest warriors in some sense.
Yeah.
They were, I mean, they definitely were fanatical. Fanatical is a fair word. You know, whether you view that as being positive, you're on the Catholic side during the Counter Reformation or opposed to them, they were definitely fanatical, and they were definitely a force, and they became a global force. Actually, we were watching something last night that had Jeremy Irons in it, and if you haven't seen the movie from the mid '80s, The Mission, which actually I think is one of Jeremy Irons' best roles, they are Jesuits. He's a Jesuit in that film, in the New World, and you get a sense for just how they were an order that was also very disciplined, like many of the monastic orders to a degree, but you get a sense for who they were. And
I have a question.
Yep.
So it's always interesting to me how a person would be reconverted from Protestantism to Catholicism, if in reality was that more just doctrinal? Like how does a person, if they have true faith in Christ, reconvert to the things that the Catholics follow?
Anybody else want to take a stab at that before I do? First of all, it's important to note that many times that reconversion was at point of torture or point of sword.
Okay.
That was not uncommon. I mean, when we primarily think of the Spanish Inquisition, for example, we primarily think of the church's attack against Jews in Spain, or others. This is also post 1492. So the Moors, for the most part, have been driven out of Spain. 1492 is an interesting date. It's obviously the date that we know for the quote unquote discovery of the New World, but it's also the end of what's called the Reconquista, which is the retaking of all of the Spanish Peninsula from the Moors. The Moors officially being expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, and most of the Spanish Inquisition that followed after that tended to be anti-Jewish. Some of it was anti-Muslim, but it also was anti-Protestant. And so in some cases, Donna, they converted back as the result of force or coercion. Or in other cases, part of the thinking might be, well, I still believe what I believe, and this is still close enough, right?
Yeah.
We're still all about Jesus. We're still all about Christ.
Gotcha.
Well, especially if not being a member of the church meant like isolation, more difficulty with trade or buying or taking care of your family because you didn't have the connection for basically commerce or something like that. I think, they may have wanted to, I don't know. It's hard for me to wrap my heads around too, why if you really grew up believing one way, that change I think is tough. And then to change back, I think it would be a struggle to change, but then to change back, unless,
Yeah.
like Don was saying, because of coercion or inability to, I don't know, take care of your family maybe or something.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that goes with that too is that, this actually, cut both ways. with us being Protestants, we tend to, think about, we align our thinking through what happened here from our perspective on it. But if you
Right.
were a Catholic in parts of Germany, it was hard for you.
Yeah.
In Protestant parts of Germany. If you were a Protestant in Spain, it was hard for you because you were in the minority position there. And that was true both ways. to Kathy's point. So, being
Yeah.
in either of the theological minorities, or if you're in the areas that were sort of equally divided or had enough of each, that's what led to the conflict,
Right.
which became so widespread. Ultimately, we're going to lead to here an entire. It's sort of considered one war, but it actually is often referred to as having phases. That's the 30 Years' War, which is a religious war that's going to flow from all of this because of all of those intermingling of thoughts and territories and contending over, who should be in charge. Or what often happened, a good way to think about it is, if I know English history much better than I know continental history, several times England went back and forth between Protestants and Catholics. Henry becomes, they're Protestant, but then does anybody remember who succeeds Henry in England?
His daughter Mary.
Yeah, and Mary goes by what adjective?
Bloody Mary.
Bloody Mary.
Because she's very Catholic after her mom.
And so very much pushes back against what had been sort of established by royal authority, the act of supremacy. Protestantism was okay until it wasn't, and Mary suppressed it. And then there's the swing back in the other direction, back to Elizabeth, and then ultimately James. And then Elizabeth, in fact, in many ways, if you know much about the Elizabethan period, she tries to sort of straddle the fence. She tries to move down the middle. Yes, they're nominally Protestant, but she doesn't do things, too many overt things to Catholics. There certainly are things that can be tied to her. And then ultimately, James, who's invited from Scotland, where they already had an established Protestant presence, is also brought into that. But again, this goes back and forth, just if you know English history. All over the continent, the same thing is happening, depending upon which prince or ruler or king has come to authority, particularly in the territories that were we later think of as being Germany, the Germanic princes who are part of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, that's a collection of, 180 to 300 principalities. And so, as you might well guess, there's not absolute uniformity across all of those principalities about who believes what and why they believe it. Again, there's the Act of Supremacy in 1534 in England. The Act of Supremacy simply said this, that Henry is the head of the church in England. It didn't say the church is changing. It just said who the head of the church was. And so even though there were other Protestant movements in England, part of the English Reformation, for all intents and purposes, religious practice, the Mass, the other things that were going on essentially remained unchanged. What we know is the Anglican Church across here in the United States today, it's the Episcopal Church. That's the American version of the Anglican Church, as it will come eventually. The Anglican Church really is the English version of Catholicism, if that makes any sense. There's really not that much theological difference between, particularly at this point in time in the early 16th century, between the Church of England and between the Catholic Church. The only thing that is really different is who is the head of the church. Questions about that?
Interesting.
Okay. Covering a little bit more. Thomas More is executed. He is still now holding on to the fact that this should have never happened. So he's not. More had been a high-level advisor to Henry, and he's executed on Henry's orders for refusing to support the Reformation. Again, the Reformation at this point, from a political sense, meaning the what? Meaning the recognition of Henry as the head of the church and not the Pope. This goes back to the investiture question that we had from many months ago. We were talking about who has the authority to invest the religious officers, whether that's in the church or whether that exists in the political organization. In 1536, Tyndale, remember, had published his English translation. He's actually captured and he's burnt at the stake for heresy. And in fact, his final words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." I think this is relevant. It's 1536, right? Tyndale is definitely on the Reformation, the idea that the scripture ought to be in English. Why is he saying, Lord, open the King of England's eyes after we're already past 1534? Because theologically, what is Henry basically still, with the exception of becoming the head of the church?
Still a Catholic.
He's still a Catholic and holding
Still
to the
Roman.
theology that's there. So I think that's a relevant thing. And Tyndale's a wonderful story. There's a reason we have the Tyndale Bible Society today, because of Tyndale's great work. And again, much of Tyndale's English translation is what ends up being in subsequent English translations up to and including the King James Version.
Was the heresy, was the charge of heresy specifically for translating the Bible, or was it?
It was for translating the Bible and other things that he had written.
Okay.
It was not exclusively for just translating the Bible into English.
Heretical.
Yeah. Although for the Catholic Church from the Catholic Church's position to do that without the approval of the Pope would have been a form of heresy to translate. In 1536, Calvin publishes the Institutes of Christian Religion, which is his systematic theology. We're going to talk a little bit more about Calvin here. We'll come back and talk about Calvin in more detail when we go into Calvinism, as it evolves out from as being a theological construct here. Important thing to understand is Calvin basically is one generation later than Luther. Let's see if I can go back here quickly, if it shows up and if you can see this here. Calvin is not born until 1509. And so Calvin is the ripe old age of what? The ripe old age of 8 when Luther tacks the theses to the door in Wittenberg. So Calvin's role in the Reformation comes later. In fact, in many ways, he's sort of considered as picking up the baton in some instances from Luther into the next generation and being its next big proponent. So Calvin and Luther are contemporaries, but they are not in the sense that Calvin comes from a later generation than that of Luther. But by 1536, now he's published his work, and he's actually in France. So when we talk more about Calvin, we're talking here about what's going on with the French part of the Reformation. Remember, Luther is what? Luther is German. So most of the things around the Lutheran Church and around that part of the Reformation are happening in Germany and related areas. So he's born in 1509 to Catholic parents. He's a French theologian and pastor, heavily influenced by the Renaissance movement, having read the writings of Aristotle. He's read Luther, though, and he's read Plato. And so he begins to put together his understanding of theology, which is what he ends up producing in on the Institutes of Christian Religion. And he definitely did not believe in purgatory. So in that sense, he's in agreement with Calvin. He still believed, though, that Old Testament laws applied to Christians. And he believed that the Catholic Church had gone down a destructive path and that Reformed Christianity would be the surest path to heaven. He definitely is a reformer, in some ways, not just wanting to reform the Catholic Church, but to recognize that it had gone so far that it really could not be reformed. A reformed Christianity is what was actually required. So in many ways, Calvin is more extreme as a reformer than Luther, in the sense that he's not only about changing or cleaning up the church's behavior, but replacing the church with something that is more viewed as being more correct. In 1533, he's forced to flee Paris, and he spends a lot of his life on the run. And we won't go into all the detail here because this also gets to be confusing history, but France for a long period of time remains religiously divided between the Huguenots, which were those that were French Protestants who followed Calvinists, and then also the French Catholic positions. And so, for example, we have later on, this is now 40 years removed, but the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, where there's a royal wedding between a Protestant and a Catholic, and that ends up having the Huguenots attempt to assassinate the French king, and the French king attacks the Huguenots. Eventually, over 100,000 French lose their lives as a result of this religious conflict.
Jeez.
Yeah. And this actually carries forward to some degree. You'll see it again. We'll actually see a little bit more here. Carries forward for multiple centuries in France. 1536 to 1540, after Henry becomes the head of the church in England, he also begins to dissolve the monasteries. And so that's an important thing because that's relevant. Why? Because they have what do the monasteries have in England?
Lots of properties, lots of,
And money.
I was going to say money.
Yeah,
Yeah,
lots of money.
people giving to the church and other resources.
So Henry, who is also continues to be in conflict with France, because England and France are always fighting, except when they're not. But even when they're not, they're fighting. This summarizes history for about half of the second millennium, give or take. He's looking for sources of income, and so the monasteries quickly become that. So as a result of that, in England proper, he dissolves the monasteries as the head of the church now, and those properties get absorbed back into, guess where? The crown. So that's one of the good things about being the king and being the head of the church, is all that property and all those resources are at your disposal because you wear both titles. In 1545, there's an ecumenical council. It happens to be the 19th one. We've covered so many of the Catholic Church. This is really where the ideas of the Counter-Reformation get formalized, and it basically produces a new updated catechism at the end of the Council of Trent. But this is where we have the Counter-Reformation and the restatement of Catholic ideals, reaffirming papal supremacy, all the things that go with that in the Council of Trent, again, that runs for almost 2 decades. And this becomes really the core document around which the Counter-Reformation is formed and seated. 1546, Luther dies. So that's 1 year into the Council of Trent that Luther is lost. His last words being, "We are beggars, this is true." We'll talk a little bit more about some of the other effects of Luther dying as we get into some more talking about the theology here. But he is lost as being the leading figure of the Reformation, but the Reformation has now grown into being a broad enough situation that it has many other leaders. For example, Calvin's come along and others that follow with him.
Does he die of like natural causes?
Best I remember, it's natural causes, yeah. In 1549, the Book of Common Prayer is published in England for the Church of England. This is an important document in English, which recognizes and sort of better formalizes the Church of England's view of worship and how it will be conducted. But again, it also in some ways is very similar still to Catholic worship. And in 1555, we finally get the Peace of Augsburg, which primarily covers the territories of what we would think of as being German Europe today. And basically, this finally grants tolerations to Lutherans within the Holy Roman Empire. Again, not all of the Holy Roman Empire was Protestant. And so the principle basically becomes whose region, his religion. And so it's whatever the religion was of the particular prince inside of that territory of the Holy Roman Empire is going to be the predominant religion of that area. But if you're in opposition to it, including being a Lutheran, and if that person happens to be Catholic, you are granted toleration. So this sort of brings to an end to the Peace of Augsburg, the conflict inside of the Holy Roman Empire in terms of armed conflict over religion. But it still continues on beyond that in other parts of Europe. 1560 is the publication of the Geneva Bible, which is the first translation in English to use verse and chapter divisions. So for the first time, we actually have references in Scripture in the Geneva Bible, which is an important precursor before we actually have the King James Version, still 50 plus years removed from the King James Version at this point, because that's in 1611. Also in 1563, the 39 Articles. This is now actually the first time that the Anglican practice of doctrine is sort of set in stone again. Now this becomes their theology now that they're separated from the Catholic Church. Ironically, a lot of this had been written by Cranmer, who had been put to death by Henry. So it's interesting how that sort of happens. Um, as much of the English Reformation is political and personality as much as it is theological. Then finally, Calvin dies in 1564, and he's succeeded by his one of his pupils, Theodore Beza. And so now these two big leaders of the Reformation, in the sense of Luther and Calvin, are gone. So it's now the next generation of reformers that are picking things up from there. Skipping way ahead to 1598, it's finally there that Henry IV of France actually grants toleration to the French Protestants in France. So think about how far that is removed, for example, from the Peace of Augsburg, which is in 1555. We have to go all the way almost 40 years later, actually, to the Edict of Nantes, which actually grants for the first time sort of religious, not religious freedom. Notice the key word there is toleration. You're tolerated. You're not exactly granted freedom in the sense that we think of modern religious freedom.
Could you tell me again, because maybe I missed it, where did the term Huguenots come from?
I literally don't remember.
What was that?
The term Huguenots.
Oh, the Huguenot, yeah.
The Huguenot. And there were also Calvinists in France. There were multiple elements of Protestantism in France. These are the Calvin Protestants, but there also were Lutheran Protestants in France, just not as many.
And how could that be Henry IV? Because Henry VIII is already dead.
This is the French.
Oh, French Henry. Sorry.
Different number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's the reason I love history so much.
And then ultimately the edict again. Ultimately, 1611 comes along till we get the authorized version of the King James Bible. Again, the King James Bible heavily influenced by Tyndale and his translations. Other draws some from what's called the Great Bible, draws from the Geneva Bible, but we actually have the first. Authorized is an interesting thing here. James certainly saw to and organized the effort to have the translation done. It is authorized in the sense that it was the king who permitted it, but it's not that it was the official only translation, except that the king had authorized it, so it sort of indirectly became that. It, of course, is referred to as the KJV or the King James Version because it's King James who has done this, which is, then thinking back through the English Reformation, Henry is followed by Mary. Mary is followed by Elizabeth. Elizabeth dies without an heir. And so as a result of that, James, who is James VI of Scotland, has a claim to the throne. He becomes James I of England. So again, if you want more detail on that, I will point you to my daughter, who can give you any piece of detail you want about that. But this is a result actually of Henry VIII's sister being married to one of the previous James of Scotland in a political marriage. And as a result of that, that line of descent coming down, having the claim to the English throne. This is part of the way that England and Scotland become united as a result of this invitation here, which is the other important thing about it. But Scotland was already heavily Protestant in its influence. And so this sort of further cemented England as a Protestant nation moving forward. In 1618 and 1609, the Dutch Reform Council meet. Only put this in here because this is where the Calvinism was really sort of upheld in a document that is, again, all of these councils normally rise in response to something, right? That's what we sort of learned throughout history here. And so it's in response to the rise of Arminianism that Calvin's views on salvation are brought back around and sort of formalized in this synod. And then finally, the 30 Years' War. It's really 29 years, 11 months, 3 weeks, and 1 day. But we round it for ease of reference here from 1618 to 1648. This is primarily fought in Germany, but it's not exclusively in Germany. It's in the Netherlands. There's elements of this in France. There's sort of 4 phases of this war. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire consisted of approximately 1,000 semi-autonomous states, city-states, principalities, this type of thing. And during this war, which was it was a religious war. It was a conflict between Protestants and Catholics. It really changed the map of Europe in a lot of ways, but somewhere between 25 and 40% in parts of what was the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic states. I was watching something yesterday that suggested over 50% of the German population was lost during this war. This was not just a minor conflict, and it raged, as you can see, for a long time. It raged for a whole, basically, generation. And so eventually it ends with the Treaty of Westphalia, which is what redraws a lot of the boundaries of Europe and basically does lead to sort of a widespread, at least religious tolerance in Europe. It sort of carried that idea of the Peace of Augsburg to a broader thing. But the 30 Years' War was very much it was a political conflict, because these conflicts were not just exclusively religious, but in addition to being a political conflict, it definitely was a religious conflict. And so looking at the date here again, now we're to 1648. We're 125-ish years removed from Luther attacking the theses before we actually get something that looks like Europe settling down during the period of the Reformation and of the Counter-Reformation. But even that doesn't last forever, because we end up in 1685, where Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King of Europe, undoubtedly probably the wealthiest and most powerful of the French monarchs, revokes the Edict of Nantes. And so no longer is it safe to be a Protestant in France. And so many of the Protestants that were in France have to flee. This is the period of the Three Musketeers, if you're familiar with that, Dumas's writings there. Again, I think this is important to understand. It's 1685. You remember when the original Edict of Nantes was, we actually go back a pretty good ways back to realize that in 1598, it was okay. But by the time we get to 1685, it's not okay. So after this period of almost, how many years is that? That's 1555, 1685, well over 100 years, it's okay to be a Protestant in France. And then suddenly it's not, still at the whim of the king. So that's a lot of historical background. Any questions about that?
Ow.
One of the questions that you might ask is, so as a result of that, when does the Reformation end?
I don't think it has.
I think that's a fair statement, Doug. I think that's a very fair statement. And so that's part of the thing to realize is 1517 is sort of an arbitrary beginning, and we know why we established that date because of the event and the things that happened immediately after that. It's certainly the rise of the Reformation, but it's tough to place the actual start of the Reformation in some ways because of Huss and because of Wycliffe before. It's also then tough to place when does it end, because if you're a Protestant in France in 1685, it doesn't feel like the Reformation's come to an end for you. And this will continue on. And it's also during this period of time that there, even inside of England, there's a reason why there are all of these various religious sects that are hopping boats and coming over to the New World and landing in the places that we call today Massachusetts and Maryland and other places like that, is they've come across because there are Protestant sects inside of England who are out of line with the Anglican Church, who are still fleeing to find religious Congregationalists and the Puritans and the others who were they were the minorities among Protestantism in England. So this is still, in many ways, the Reformation is still going on for them as well.
So it's kind of hard for me to to get the fact that France is doing something different basically than England's doing, than Germany's doing, than, so I don't know, since I learned better with seeing things than just reading things, I'm trying to, in my head, kind of like, at this time over in Spain, this is what's going on. In France, this is what's going on. In England, this is what's going on. In Germany, what's going on. I guess I kind of thought that everything was,
Uniform.
yeah, more uniform.
Yeah, and part of what I struggle with there, despite being a fan of history and continental history, I find confusing because because it is confusing. I think that's why I find it confusing, because it is confusing and it's complex. Is that, you know, we tend to think of the map of Europe today with these very large nation states. In other words, when we say Germany, that's a bigger area on the map. When we say France, that's a bigger area on the map. When you go back and look at, I think it's probably back on that 30 Years War slide, it's a lot, it's smaller territories. The modern nation state, for example, modern Germany doesn't rise until the late 19th century under Bismarck, where he unites a lot of the principalities and the elements that were there. And so when we go back and look at it, for me, when I go back and think about it historically and try to put a stamp on it, again, I want to think of these bigger blobs, these bigger territories. And they weren't big territories. They were smaller subdivisions inside of those territories, which is why you have the various distinction. And, you know, we can draw that to a modern conclusion. Are New York and California the same? No. Are Texas and New York the same? No. But they're part of the United States. So there is this broader, you know, this broader sort of summary geographic thing, but understanding that there are unique elements inside of each one of these, even the larger, what we think of as being modern nation states that existed at the time. And just understanding those differences is hard, because I just think it's hard for us to, grasp all of the subtleties of that. Further questions, comments? I know this was heavy on the history side today, but I wanted to have this so that we have the backdrop as we're covering, as we start going through the rest of the theology part, so we can tie back to the fact that there was this Counter-Reformation. There's the role that the Jesuits are playing, both almost militarily, but also certainly scholastically. You know, what's going on in France, where there's a lot of confusion in France. Why is this important? Because people are dying for these beliefs in like the 30 Years War and in some of the other persecutions that are going on. Why is it important to know what you believe? Well, because are you willing to fight for it? It's what it literally becomes.
Wow.
Just to give a quick preview, I'll go ahead and share my screen again. Screen 2. Share. All right. Where we will pick up next week, we'll be getting back into the theology part, in the sense that we will pick up with the 5 solas, which we've already talked a lot about sola scriptura, but we will get back into the other solas of the Reformation, particularly sola fide and sola gratia. So by faith alone and by grace alone.
Different solas than what we've talked about before, though.
Well, we talked about sola scriptura.
Well, but we also talked about sola ecclesia. These are different solas.
These are the 5 solas of the Reformation.
Of the Reformation.
Questions, comments, dissensions? Dissensions are allowed here.
Not working.
Is what working?
Work email.
No, that was my reminder. I snoozed it.
Hey, just quick update, Sherry. You put in the chat, Zach's test was positive.
Yes. Did I just get a, wait. I can't find me. Where?
And I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now.
Where am I?
Sorry.